Today on The State of Us, what happens if war comes to Taiwan? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we're looking at an article from the Wall Street Journal entitled The Coming War Over Taiwan. Ultimately, we've been focused pretty heavily on an international stage anyway on Ukraine and what Russia's been doing with their invasion and how that war has been going. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that China may use this as an opportunity for something they've wanted for a long time, which of course is to, as they might say, reunify Taiwan or liberate Taiwan. And we might say invade or hostile takeover or put in place a dictatorship or, any number of other things. So we're going to look at today why that prospect seems like it could be more likely now, how the U.S. might be involved, and 5 things related to what we could do to diminish the likelihood of that happening. So we've got a lot to talk about, but before we dive in, Lance, what's our word of the day?
Well, it's a short one today. It's wanton. W-A-N-T-O-N, 2 syllables. Wanton. It is an adjective. It means senseless, unprovoked, unjustifiable, or deliberately malicious.
In other words, we want the United States to not be wanton about the situation in Taiwan.
Well, or we don't want the Chinese government to be wanton in their actions towards Taiwan.
Yes.
So
ideally both.
Both.
Hopefully, right?
Different objectives, but
yes.
Hope that neither one of them have wanton intentions.
So this article is in the review section of the Wall Street Journal. So keeping in mind it's an opinion, but it provides some good information, and Lance and I are going to kind of try to break it down for you. Part of what it opens is by explaining that the U.S. is running out of time to prevent a cataclysmic war in the Western Pacific. We've obviously been focused a good bit on Ukraine, but Xi Jinping, the president of China, appears to be preparing for an even more consequential onslaught against Taiwan. Mr. Xi's China is fueled by a dangerous mix of strength and weakness. Faced with profound economic, demographic, and strategic problems, it will be tempted to use its military power to transform the existing order while it still has the opportunity. I think part of what is important to understand, and you're going to hear this kind of as we go throughout, Lance, right, is there's a number of factors that tell us, and when I say us, me, you, people like this gentleman who's a distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and military experts, right, that if China was going to make a move, it may come before the year 2030 because that would be an opportune time for it to do so for any number of reasons.
The issue here is that they have what is known as historically peaking power syndrome. And that is governments, countries like China tend to become more aggressive as they become fearful that they may be on decline. And that is, you say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? China's this, China's that. Yeah, and they're also, with COVID, production is going down. They have, they're paying off for the idea of 2 or 3 decades ago where they went to one child, which means now they're going to run short of workers, their one child policy for families. Well, they're fast approaching where they're going to have more senior citizens than they will have babies being produced, which means they've built their power on industrialization, not unlike the United States did, over 100 years ago. But by doing so, now they're running the risk of starting to lose that power. So when your entire government system has been, we want to reinvigorate China and make China the master that it was centuries ago, there's an old saying, strike while the iron is hot. It appears that in the future, China will be a little bit weaker because they will not be able to keep up their industrial prowess because they will not have enough people to man all the factories. Therefore, the author of this opinion piece is saying this is what leads many leaders in the past to decide to go to war earlier rather than later because, well, we have all of the advantages now. We're never going to be stronger than we are now. If we're going to ever achieve the end result that we want to achieve, then we have to do it now.
And to Lance's point, China's approaching demographic catastrophe. It's going to lose 70 million working age individuals over the next decade while gaining 120 million senior citizens. So definitely a discrepancy there, right?
And we're seeing the same thing here in the United States, right? In that we have more jobs available than we have people who are looking for a job. And we know what that's doing to our supply chain. We know what that's doing, how it's affecting inflation. We know how it's affecting our ability to get things made and to be serviced and to, how many of us are waiting in lines and waiting for things that are on back order and those kinds of things. China's having it as well, but on a much grander scale. Not to go down the rabbit hole, we have an upcoming show about, is it time to open up immigration, to bring more workers in to solve the worker problem? China won't do that, right? China doesn't have that kind of idea or that history to allow foreigners to come into their country to fill these jobs. Hence, if you're the president of China, you're looking at, we're going to get weaker here pretty quickly.
Right. Well, and, as much as obviously Mr. Xi touts, the expansion of the East and decline of the West, ultimately, the internal reports of the Chinese government that have been leaked, that either U.S. intelligence has got their hands on or journalists have got their hands on, all indicate that China's own internal reports show that in the long term, it's probably going to be less competitive and that it probably cannot outpace, America in a marathon. However, and that's part of what we're talking about today, right? If they're going to cause substantial upheaval, now is the time to do it. And that's part of what Lance is talking about. Because, so the long term, right, China's probably going to fall a little bit from where they are. In the near term, though, they may be more dangerous, more willing to gamble, more willing to take some of these leaps that they've been waiting on because, as we've talked about on this show many times, right, they've been building, they've been working toward this.
Well, here's the scariest part to me. For the past decade, and this is from the article, for the past decade, China's factories have churned out ammunition and put warships to sea faster than any country since World War II. Hence, their military power is at its highest right now that it's ever been, while their economic power is starting to wane. And so now, will they start to approach this in a wanton manner and say, we're going to push all of our chips in, let it fall where it may, and even if we lose the war, and we're going to get into this, but even if we lose the war, we're going to destroy the world's economy and hurt all of our enemies just as well. So even if we don't win, we're going to destroy everything.
Everybody's going to be hurting.
Everybody's going to be hurting.
It won't just be us.
Right. And so we won't be alone. And so we can inflict damage to everybody else.
So at the same time that they're churning out more ships and ammunition than any other country since World War II, U.S. military power is about to dip. The mid-2020s will witness the mass retirement of aging U.S. cruisers, guided missile submarines, and long-range bombers, leaving the U.S. military with hundreds fewer missile launchers, which is the key metric of modern naval firepower, floating and flying around East Asia. So while Washington, Tokyo, and Taipei are all undertaking much-needed defense programs focused on denying Chinese hegemony in Asia, those efforts aren't likely to bear much fruit until the 2030s. Of course, Mr. Xi knows this, right? I mean, China knows this. And so, again, it may seem wanton, but ultimately, if you don't do it now, right, and I'm sure that's part of what they're thinking, if we don't do it now, we may not have another opportunity for 50, 60 or more years, right?
Right, because the United States has plans to have everything re-strengthened by 2030.
So if you were going to do it, you do it when they're, not that we're weak, but you do it when you're the least strong, right? If you're going to take, because
you're going to roll the dice and take a chance, you attack, you take your opportunity when your opponent is at its weakest point and when you are the strongest. That doesn't mean that you're stronger than your opponent, but if you know you're going to have to pick a fight, you're going to pick the fight when you're at your strongest and your opponent is at their weakest. Even though your opponent at their weakest might still be stronger than you.
Well, and keeping in mind that, there's this lovely little thing, right, that's called the Taiwan Relations Act, or the TRA, which was enacted the 10th of April, 1979, passed by Congress. And the act ultimately, there's a lot of different provisions, but one of them is that the TRA requires the United States to have a policy to, quote, provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character and to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. So I think that, we've been selling arms in compliance with the TRA. And also, I guess it's important, to keep in mind that we say that this isn't in conflict with the One China policy, which is, of course, China's official, Taiwan is technically part of China sort of thing. But at the same time, we have a law on the books that, in many ways, requires us to essentially come to the defense, right, of Taiwan if they were to be attacked in a way that, would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. And surely a Chinese invasion would jeopardize the security or social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. I
and hence also clear. Of the United States.
Yes.
Because, and I know it's time to go to break, but I'm going to throw this in so that you can understand this. The RAND Corporation has done a study, and 1 year of fighting between China and the United States over Taiwan would cut America's gross domestic product by 5 to 10% and China's by 25 to 35%. A global depression would be all but guaranteed. This is according to the RAND Corporation.
So let's talk about what it would look like. How would they actually go about this? And what could we do as the United States, our allies, to defend against it? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. President Xi Jinping of China has repeatedly said, so on more than one occasion, that the task of liberating Taiwan cannot be passed down from generation to generation. You're producing more ships and ammunitions than any country since World War II. You have conducted any number of military exercises near Taiwan, regularly reinforced your One China policy. Of course, we had the whole...
Your own government's telling you that you're going to weaken economically in the future.
We've had, obviously, everything that's been going on in Hong Kong, which we've covered, and basically China reasserting its dominance there, and essentially saying the independence you had is gone. So it's not as if there isn't anything to suggest that they would do this, not the least of which is everything we talked about in the first segment, the confluence of all these different things that go together. So if they were going to do it, what would the strategy likely be? Well, to achieve that goal, China is probably going to have to go big and brutal from the start. Its war plan could well involve a surprise missile and air attack against Taiwan and U.S. military bases in the Pacific, strikes on the satellite communications that underpin the American way of war, and a wave of sabotage and assassinations within Taiwan, all as a prelude to a massive airborne and amphibious invasion of the island. The economic fallout from that, which Lance briefly mentioned, would be horrendous. The world might find itself cut off from more than 90% of cutting-edge semiconductors that are manufactured in Taiwan, and the other terrible statistics that Lance had already mentioned, probably leading to a global recession. That said, the article points out to us that the situation isn't hopeless. A smart, committed defender could turn the operation into a bloody nightmare for invading forces. And doing so doesn't require defying the laws of physics. It just requires moving now to make an invasion look all too daunting for a risk-prone peaking power, as Lance described them before. So what are our steps? Well, the first big one, right, Lance, is the Pentagon turning the Taiwan Strait into a death trap for attacking forces by stocking up on tools that are ready or nearly ready today. And this includes basically deploying a whole host of all manner of jammers, communication disruption, devices, and generally speaking, most of these are not very large pieces of equipment. You deploy them all over the place, you cripple China's ability to communicate with its forces as it approaches Taiwan. You disrupt its ability to effectively deploy drones. All of that's going to have a big impact on drastically slowing and undermining the coordination of their assault.
It's not that it would be that difficult for us to do, but with war in Ukraine and worrying about Putin and everything else, we have not identified this as the most important thing to do within the government. Now, I'm not saying we don't have other things that are very important, but that's another reason why China might be looking to do this, because they'll hit us while we're busy dealing with other things. And the point of this author is we need to take care of this now. So that's the first thing to do, right? Do the high-tech stuff. That's easy to do. Is not that, you just have to make the commitment to do it. We can get it done. We have the materials, we have the bases, we have the ships that we could create this high-tech minefield. So let's do it so that the Chinese are like, oh, crap, now they know we're coming. We can't surprise them.
Well, and if your goal, right, is to go big and brutal from the start, then the defense strategy against big and brutal, or rather the strategy to deter such an action, would be to show that going big and brutal is going to be blunted, force you to go slower, and force you to not go as at much of scale because you cannot effectively communicate through the high-tech minefield.
Historically, if you remember World War II, what saved Great Britain from the German blitzkrieg? It was the use and introduction of radar. That the Germans had just bombarded everybody else, and the British used the new technology at the time, radar, to know when the German planes were coming, and they were able to fight back. And that stopped, and Hitler's like, I don't really want to go in there because it's not as easy as it has been. I'll turn to Russia. This is kind of the same concept in my mind. It's like, make it very difficult for your opponent to hit you hard and fast.
Right.
And then maybe that will stop them from coming at all.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is all about the idea of making sure that the U.S. doesn't have a glass jaw.
And don't take offense at that, folks. We're not saying America's weak, right?
Right.
But we're talking about how will the Chinese see us.
Well, and have we updated things, right? If China's going to behave in a wanton regard, they have to feel like we're not just doing business as usual, that we've taken notice and that we're doing things to strengthen, not saying it's weak, but strengthen our position and think about it in a more modern context. Because right now, Lance, what's the trouble with the way our forces are organized in the Pacific?
Well, the problem is we have most of our forces on a couple of bases.
Guam and Okinawa, right?
So what that means is right now the Chinese could hit those two bases and basically wipe out our presence in the Far East.
Severely cripple our ability to respond quickly to a big, bold effort on China's part.
Right.
Because we have additional equipment, but if you knock out our two largest bases or you severely cripple them, right, it's going to take some time for us to get new forces and equipment into position.
So what we need to do is move those people around, move those ships around. All right. Think again, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, right? We weren't ready and we lined everything up because we thought that was the safest way, and it led to more destruction. And also the whole glass jaw thing, because the Japanese thought we were weak. So they attacked us thinking they wouldn't get anything. And, they awoke the sleeping dog and we went after them. And, the rest, as we know, we studied in history in World War II. But that's kind of what we're trying to say here is let's stop this. And how do we do it? Well, we have our few big bases. We don't leave them, but let's make sure that we upgrade their defense system. Let's have more missile defenses. Let's harden the shelters up, outfitting them with the latest things to stop any kind of destruction from going on, and then spread our people out on all the islands in the South Pacific. So all of a sudden, we're not vulnerable to the glass jaw reference here. We're not vulnerable to that one big lucky punch that wipes us out. And then all of a sudden, we're having to attack and defend from Hawaii or from the west coast of the United States. So let's spread out our defenses in Southeast Asia, where we have allies and where we have ships, and spread them out so that one concentrated attack cannot take us out. And if we do that, now we're, once again, second step on making it difficult for China to get that early advantage, that early knockout blow.
Part of hanging tough is also making sure that they feel like they can't outlast us. And that's kind of the second part of the glass jaw piece, right? Which is this notion that we have to have enough ammunition stockpiled and we have to have the supply lines or the sources of supply ready to provide more should we end up needing it. And again, the key here isn't, we have to spend fortunes and fortunes producing a bunch of stuff we may never use. The goal is to demonstrate to China that if you start this, you're not going to be able to go big right away. We're going to blunt your efforts, and you're not going to be able to outlast us either, because we're ready to keep not only our forces supplied, but this is the next thing, right? Make sure that Taiwan can help themselves, not just the U.S., take care of Taiwan, but also make sure that Taiwan is a real partner in this fight and able to actually defend their sovereignty with our assistance rather than relying exclusively on the United States to do it for them. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about coming up next, because we've still got 3 more points to hit about what we have to do to make sure that ultimately Taiwan can defend itself and that we can defend our positions in Taiwan. And we also have to talk about why do we want to do this? Because I guess we've kind of just assumed right throughout the episode that everybody understands why. But why not leave it alone? Well, one of the big things, right, just from a logic standpoint, remember what we talked about there from an economy. You've noticed all those dealership lots vacant, right, of cars, and hard to get certain computers, and increasing cost of different pieces of technology and supply chain shortages. Well, Taiwan produces a lot of semiconductors. Remember that? And not to boil it down to that, because I think that there's a totally different reason that we ought to be involved. But if we just want to talk economics, that's one of them. What are the other reasons? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. The third thing the United States must do, right, is help Taiwan help itself. If Taiwan doesn't pick up the pace, nothing the U.S. can do will save it. However, America should provide money, hardware, and expertise to make the island a tougher target if Taiwan, in fact, follows through with some of its plans to bolster its defensive capabilities. Taiwan's obviously not, dumb. They know that this is a real possibility. They've known for a long time, and they've tried to prepare for it. It's becoming increasingly likely they have to ramp up their own efforts, and we have to help them do that. Because again, if we're going to rely solely on the United States to do it, that's going to be tricky, because we have some unofficially limited force presence in Taiwan. But it's not like we maintain big military bases there or large staging areas where it's going to be really easy for us to defend the island itself. We have to focus our efforts on what our Navy can do, right? What our bases can do to provide support. So Taiwan has to be ready for some of those items for themselves. And we can help them be ready for that, which again is going to show a more unified, stronger front. And what does that do? It makes it, to Lance's point, less likely. China looks at this and says, the odds are not looking as good, right? They're looking more daunting.
Well, and we have to be careful because historically speaking, you think of Vietnam and just the latest war in Afghanistan, we did some of that, right? We went in and we supported the people there and trained their people, and we fought side by side with them, and then eventually we pulled out, right? Because they weren't able to do it by themselves. So I think here's where we can learn from history. Yes, we have to train them. Yes, we have to give them stuff, but we will have to be ready to stay here. And to your point, the sheer economics of it, not just the humanitarian side, means we need to stay there because we need, the processors, and we need all the things that Taiwan is selling to us because it's important to our growing economy and our way of life.
Well, because we see what's happening in Ukraine, right? I mean, we see that Taiwan may resist, but it's going to be bloody, messy. It's going to drastically disrupt the global economy. And there's no guarantee that Taiwan and or Ukraine can resist forever.
And to put the puzzle together, because we're coming down to the last two pieces, the next piece I want to talk about is that by doing this, we're going to show China that Taiwan is not in this by themselves. And not only will America come to their aid, but so will a variety of other countries. We need to talk to the Indian government and Australia because their navies could help us choke off oil imports. And we need to talk to our European allies and make sure that the Chinese know that France and England are behind us with their navies as well. And it's all part of that puzzle, right? It's not just that the United States is going to train the Taiwanese soldiers and give the Taiwanese government the weapons they need, but also maybe sign some treaties or sign some agreements with, all of these other powers in Southeast Asia and in Europe who are going to say, this is going to destroy, to your point of Ukraine, this is going to destroy our economies because we know we've talked multiple times on this show what the war in Ukraine could do to our European allies this winter as far as trying to stay warm and trying to take care of their people and have enough heating oil to get through the winter. So when we talk about the kind of destruction that a war with Taiwan would do, we need to show the Chinese government before it ever starts, hey, Taiwan not only has the support of the United States, but look, India's going to get involved. Australia is going to get involved. France is going to get involved. England's going to get involved, and they're all going to get involved against you. Now, do you really want to go to war here? Is this what you really want to start? We know you want to become a world power, and your power is waning, and you think this is the time to strike. The iron is hot. This is our time to strike. Do you really want to strike when you're going to have all of these people? You're not just going to fight Taiwan, and you're not even just going to fight Taiwan in the United States. You're going to fight all of these other powers who have their own navies and their own missile defense systems and their own technology, and they're all going to be on the side of Taiwan. It's not like you're just going to attack little old Taiwan by itself. And it's not like you can go for the knockout punch against the United States at a couple big bases. There's going to be all of this worldwide support to protect Taiwan because of what it means to the world economy.
The other thing, and this kind of is the basic one, right, to wrap up with, is the notion of you want to exploit your enemy's weaknesses. And Lance talks some about, we can cut them off, right, from access to strategic energy reserves that would help cripple their economy. That's one weakness they have, is they rely on those foreign energy imports. The other thing is that, and this is more of a military one specifically, but keeping in mind that the People's Liberation Army, which is the military of China, right, hasn't fought a major war since invading Vietnam in 1979. And therefore, it hasn't tested its modern command and control processes under fire in a major arena. By developing the ability through cyber attacks and related means to inject confusion into military communication networks, the Pentagon can make Chinese officials wonder how glitchy their forces will be in combat, which kind of wraps back to that first notion, right, of deploying this, digital minefield, so to speak, or virtual minefield, is the notion that what you're trying to do is sow that uncertainty in them that then leads them to be less confident in their ability to execute and probably diminishes their ability to execute. Because as we know, and this is something, right, that we've seen with Russia in Ukraine, is it's not gone as well for Russia as they thought it would go, partly because their modern military really hasn't tested much of their strategy and command and control components up until now, not on this scale. And they found out, there's a number of problems that need addressed. And since China is in a similar situation, not that they don't use the same system, but same thing with their system really hasn't been tested at scale. And so they really don't know how it's going to go. And if we can make them more uncertain about their confidence in that, that is another adding factor, right, to all these other things about, do we do this or not?
Yeah, if you're afraid of a wanton attitude from China, then you show them why they shouldn't just go into this blindly, right? That, okay, this might be the best time for you, but when you start to look at all of these things that we're doing and all of the allies that we have and all the damage that we can cause you, is this really what you want to do? You've done some miraculous things. You've built up your economy. There's a worldwide respect for you now. Do you really want to chance it? Because look at all of these things that we've done. Now, and I'll throw it to you here. Here's the problem. We haven't done any of these things.
Right.
That's the, to sum it all up for you folks, we just went over all the things we could do, right? To stop the Chinese, to make the Chinese government look at this and say, yeah, we don't want to do this. The problem is we haven't done this, right? So by not doing this, China can have that wanton attitude and just say, you know what? We're going to throw it in, right? We're going to roll the dice and we're going to take a chance because the U.S. isn't ready. They've got all their forces in the same spot. There's no worldwide agreement against us or against us doing this. So therefore, it's worth the chance. It's worth taking the risk. That's why we're talking about it. That's why we feel, or I shouldn't speak for Justin. It's why I feel the U.S. government needs to get busy yesterday implementing what this author says, because I don't want to just hope that China's smart enough not to do this. I fear that wanton attitude and that they will start this fight. I'm not fearful that we won't win, but why risk it if doing some of these things might stop it? We've talked about that theory on this show for years, and that is, yes, it's going to cost money, but by spending the money up front, you're going to quite possibly save yourselves 3 times the amount of money on the back end. Much easier to spend money to prevent a fight than it is to spend money on a fight.
I would point folks to, in the history of this show, we had the opportunity to cover Russia's aggression, invasion, and takeover of Crimea, right? They're not going to do it. That was everybody, it's not really going to happen. And then it happens. And then we let it happen. And then a few years go by, and then what happens? Then China decides, we don't like this business about Hong Kong having this de facto independence that they have, this right to some degree of self-government. We don't like that. So we're just going to do away with it, despite that the people of Hong Kong don't want that, despite that when the United Kingdom returned, Hong Kong to Chinese rule, that part of the agreement was, that you really can't do that. Regardless of all that, we're just going to do it. So, because they see, hey, Russia invaded basically and annexed a country, and the world didn't do.
China can have that wanton attitude and just say, you know what? We're going to throw it in, right? We're going to roll the dice and we're going to take a chance because the U.S. isn't ready. They've got all their forces in the same spot. There's no worldwide agreement against us or against us doing this. So therefore, it's worth the chance. It's worth taking the risk. That's why we're talking about it. That's why we feel, or I shouldn't speak for Justin. It's why I feel the U.S. government needs to get busy yesterday implementing what this author says, because I don't want to just hope that China's smart enough not to do this. I fear that wanton attitude and that they will start this fight. I'm not fearful that we won't win, but why risk it if doing some of these things might stop it? We've talked about that theory on this show for years, and that is, yes, it's going to cost money, but by spending the money up front, you're going to quite possibly save yourselves 3 times the amount of money on the back end. Much easier to spend money to prevent a fight than it is to spend money on a fight.
I would point folks to, in the history of this show, we had the opportunity to cover Russia's aggression, invasion, and takeover of Crimea, right? They're not going to do it. They're not, that was everybody, it's not really going to happen. And then it happens. And then we let it happen. And then a few years go by. And then what happens? Then China decides, we don't like this business about Hong Kong having this de facto independence that they have, this rights to some degree of self-government. We don't like that. So we're just going to do away with it. Despite that the people of Hong Kong don't want that, despite that when the United Kingdom returned, Hong Kong to Chinese rule, that part of the agreement was, that you really can't do that. Regardless of all that, we're just going to do it. So, because they see, hey, Russia invaded basically and annexed a country, and the world didn't do squat, so they basically stole part of Ukraine, and, and nobody did anything. We did sanctions and stuff, but they took it, right? They took it, they got it, so Hong Kong's already technically ours, which the world agrees to. So who cares if we take away their liberties? That's small potatoes in comparison to Crimea. And basically they've gotten away with that. And then what happens a year or two later, right, is, oh, gee, now Russia decides that it's time to invade Ukraine, right? Because, we got away with Crimea. China got away with Hong Kong. So why not? It doesn't seem like people are going to really step up and stop us. Now there's a war that's active in Ukraine. Why would China not look at all of those things and say, democracies are falling, and the other world democracies aren't doing much to stop it. Now, I will say that obviously in recent months, and we've talked about that in Ukraine, we have seen definitely a unified effort in saying, we're going to provide support to Ukraine. What we have not seen, which still just irks me, and that's what I'm so afraid of in this, is part of what Lance talked about. There was so much we could have done ahead of that to have prevented what is happening right now. Not the least of which was provide more of the equipment that we've already provided now to Ukraine up front, because that may have stopped Russia from